Where we are, folks. Another Tuesday evening. Great to have you on. We're in pre-show mode just for a second or two. Great to have everybody here. And Yogi Bear, thank you very much for the super chat fiat. The doggies will really appreciate it. Thank you so much for that. That's absolutely great. Great way to start the show. And yeah, the dogs are here, of course, as you would expect. Pretty relaxed in their baskets at the moment, having been out for a walk this morning. And generally, I think in pretty good fettle. It's as Cookie says, they come back from the morning pub crawl. It does look a bit like that, doesn't it? But we had quite a long walk this morning, and the weather's better here today, so it's a little nicer to have a bit of exercise. And just for those interested, here's the broader view of the studio with the normal setup. So I've got the chat up there. You can see I've got my main screen here for all the data I'm going to share with you. I've got the multi-view here, which is where I monitor the stream and the mix. And over here, I've got another screen, which is essentially keeping an eye on the overall YouTube response. So that's the way I do it. Bit complicated. I'm going to make a video over the next little while in terms of how we put all this together, because the settlement, the studio is now settled down quite nicely. So I thought it was a good time to do that. And of course, today it's just me. I'm going to be sharing some information with you about my latest modeling and also some of the broader questions that I think we face. Great to see everybody on. I'm going to take the pre-show off and I'm going to start the formal intro. I'll be back in just a moment. Well, good evening and welcome to this live stream. Martin North here on the 12th of December 2023. Great to have you back on for another show. And yeah, it's interesting. Bear808 said, I just watched 2 ads. Yeah, so YouTube's sort of imposed a sort of an ad routine now in the way the show works. So not much I can do about it, really. So bear with me. And yeah, it does mean it is monetized, which I guess is helpful in terms of just keeping some of the costs under control. A lot to talk about tonight, of course, particularly around the data, which is not looking particularly positive, I must say. But just before I get into that in more detail, let me just go through the normal little bit of introduction in terms of the house rules and those sorts of things, insofar that, you know, there are just a few things I want to remind you about. We're not providing specific financial advice. This is a general conversation only, not property advice or anything. It's just a little bit of a general discussion, but it is based off data, of course. We do moderate the chat room, so please play nice, but also feel free to throw your chat and comments and questions in. Of course, I won't necessarily follow all of the threads. There are just so many, but it is a good place for people to come and express their views and opinions. And I saw a few interesting off-topic conversations too, which are quite funny. This is as at the 12th of December, as I said, if you're watching in replay. And if you'd like to get a question to me directly, if you use @Walk the World, that makes quite sure that I see it. It goes into my separate queue, and that means that there's a good chance that I'll be able to get to it. And of course, I've also enabled Super Chat, as you've seen already, always greatly appreciated. We don't do this because we're trying to make a profit, but simply because we think there's a really important conversation to have. So any contributions via Super Chat are greatly appreciated. That's helped to fund what we do here. And that means that you can get your question top of the list, or indeed make a contribution more generally to what's going on. So that's all about that. And good to see a few other ones. Jump for Joys there, I see. And Smooth was on earlier on. And interesting discussions about whether the retail environment is buoyant or not. I think there's a bit of a contradictory sort of findings at the moment. Depends where you go. In some areas across the country, things are quite busy. In others, I'm getting quite a lot of stories now of people not having enough money really to spend, although of course buy now pay later is doing quite well. So that'll sort of extend and pretend a bit longer. And a lot of the thematics today, I think, will be about extend and pretend to an extent, because, there are people still saying, there's nothing to see here, everything's fine. There are others saying, hang on a moment, things are looking a little bit more twitchy now. So what I want to do tonight is to do three things. Firstly, I'm going to do a quick skip over some new data in terms of some of those information sources over the last few days, specifically focusing on household finances and how they're faring. We'll touch on home prices. Then I'm going to quickly skip over some of the mortgage stress analysis at a high level. I did make a show the other day, which was actually trying to lay the foundations for this show. And so what it means is that I can then skip through into the third section, which is looking at individual postcodes. And I've already got quite a few people asking for postcodes. As we go into the show a bit later, I'll be able to put some of those up, and I've got one there on postcode 2200. So when I come to the later part of the show, that'll be in the second half, I'll make sure that I cover that one as well as any other postcodes that are actually coming up later on. And, Cookie Boy makes the point, I think absolutely right. The world economy is struggling, but, how weird that property prices are at significantly high levels, and not just in Australia, but in the UK and in other places too. And of course, this is an overhang from the very free debt cycle that we had, and also the significant money that was thrown at the various economies around the world through the COVID period. So there's a bunch of reasons why we are where we are. But of course, the real question is now, where do we go next? Which of course is the big question. Anyway, let me just steer across to some of these slides. So this was one that I thought was really interesting in terms of household income flows, because it tries to encapsulate just in one slide, the key points. And if you look at the start of labour income, you can see there, you can also see that there was an additional flow of income in, thanks to the higher interest rates on deposits, about 2.2 billion. According to Westpac. But then the rate hikes have actually also taken out about 2.6 billion out of the finances. And then, of course, you've got the LMITO, which was the tax support for lower income earners, which was removed. And also, of course, the big 6.5 billion increase in tax payments. And this is the one that is really, really important for people to understand. When I calculate my stress analysis, I look at disposable income after tax, and this is a really important issue. So a lot of people are paying a lot more tax. And of course, you've also got the savings drawdown, which is the other factor, which is leading to, people surviving by pulling savings out, because of course we had a lot of money given to a lot of households through the COVID period, but that's now being reversed. And just on the income tax, this was from IFM showing that the household tax paid on income is as high pretty much as it's been at 17.2%. That's just on household tax paid. But if you also compare it with the income tax payments, slightly more broader number, and also compare it with interest payments, the net interest payments, you can see that in fact the imposts on households from tax, and this is because of course the bands have not moved up with inflation, they've been frozen. And what that basically means is you have huge amounts of flows out for households. And therefore the disposable income, which is effectively, if you look at the gross disposable income, is dropping. And in fact, this is a quite interesting chart from Alex Joyner, because you can see there that really this is now looking at levels of slowdown in terms of household disposable income. This is sort of year on year relative to what we've had over the last few years. And in fact, you have to go back to the 1990s to see such low levels. So that's a really important. Now, remember, that's gross disposable income. So that's obviously not accounting for some of the other issues that we know from a net tax perspective. And just going on the household savings, again, household savings is now in negative. So people are pulling more out than they're putting in. And interestingly, of course, you've also got high rent. The rent inflation is still sitting up there at a very significantly high number. And it's sort of back to where it was in 2008 briefly, but the last decade, of course, it was a lot lower. So the whole rent story leads to low rental vacancy rates. This is from CoreLogic. We're really seeing very, very low numbers there. And the annual changes are actually quite diverse. This is again from CoreLogic, showing that the rent changes do vary. So, interestingly, Hobart and Canberra saw rent falls, declines across Canberra market, they say, are easing. And you can see there's some variations between units and houses as well. So again, you have to go granular really to think about what may be going on. Now, the retail sales, of course, disappointed. And if you look, you can see that there's a retail sales volume. And of course, the value is higher because of inflation, but the volume is still significantly down. And what's interesting about that is that different segments of the population are spending differently. If you're in the older segments, you're still spending quite freely. If you're in the younger segments, you're spending much less freely, simply because they've got less income coming in and less ability to spend. Consumer sentiment still pretty bad. This is a longer term view from the RBA, and you can see there that both those owning outright, those owner occupiers, and those with renters are all, impacted to an extent, but in fact, owner occupiers seem to be probably feeling it because of the interest rate rises. And the Melbourne Institute Westpac Consumer Sentiment Index that came out today was also down in the gutter, although the Roy Morgan one was slightly stronger, but still, if you look at it over the long-term trend, you can see that it's still way down. So consumer confidence is pretty shot. And some of the other indicators of household financial stress, like Google searches on financial stress or inquiries, the National Debt Helpline, are up. And interestingly, of course, there's now a bit of an indication that city home prices are beginning to ease back again. This is from Shane Oliver, AMP. The longer term view for the house price boom from Minek Advisors showed that the house price to GDP per capita is shot off the charts relative to where it's been for a long time. So we know households are highly leveraged. And just in terms of house prices, there's some significant variation. So if you look at, for example, Darwin across the value set, so the lowest volume value, the medium value, and the higher value, it's pretty much down everywhere. In some other places, like in the ACT, the upper values are still rising, but the lower values less so. And in fact, in Melbourne, you can see here from CoreLogic that the 25th percentile average was 0.4% over the 3 months to November. That's a very small rise. Whereas if you look in Perth, pretty much across the board, you've got 6.3%, 5.8%, and 4.7%. So again, granularity is important. And just to make this really clear, if you look at Hobart, Hobart has over the past year dropped 3% and are now 11.1% below the record high, which was back in March 2022. And you'll see Tasmania is on my charts shortly, whereas Perth is now at a record high. And over the past year, they've gone up 13.5%. So there's huge variations across the country. Listings are still sort of down a little bit. CoreLogic is saying that they're sort of closer to the 5-year average now, but listings are not flash. And of course, up to Christmas, you'd expect sales to ease off, although lending last month, or this is October, was quite strong, particularly for owner-occupied finance, as well as some investment finance. This was a shocking picture that I saw. I made a show on this the other day. The tent city in Brisbane, and of course in other places, I'm getting quite a few different reports of people living in tents or in cars because they just cannot get anywhere else. And of course, the Premier of Queensland has just stepped down, so it'll be interesting to see whether there's any change under the new one. But this is a structural issue, which is a real worry. And just in terms of the announcements this week on the migration, Shane Oliver made the point that, what they're talking about, particularly tidying up perhaps some of the short-term student visas, nevertheless, net migration is still going to be quite strong. And as I made a show about the other day with Edwin, it's still well above average. And as I've said before, you need to actually be building a lot more properties relative to where we are building properties to be able to deal with it. So this is a really, really big deal. And the bottom line is this, that whilst they are doing a little bit to migration, they're still bringing a lot of people with money, a lot of people who can buy property, and therefore we're not building enough relative to the supply. So this is really not going to have a huge amount of impact, I think. Right, let me just continue to step through now in terms of the mortgage stress. So for those who've not been on the show before, we model this on a regular basis from our households. The surveys run weekly. We plug it in each month into the core market model. And the core market model, we can slice and dice data all sorts of different ways. And that allows us also to form a view as to where things might go based on some scenarios. And our scenarios basically take the mortgage stress, the trajectory of price data, the buying and selling intentions, the migration, the economic data, things like CPI, wages and employment, put into the core market model and through our scenarios. And that then gives us a view of where the scenarios might take house prices over the next 2 or 3 years. And just quickly, as of course I often say, we do still offer a one-to-one service. If you want individual confidential discussion with me about a particular suburb, we can do that. We can look at the trend data in the particular postcode. But this isn't financial advice. This is based on the underlying modelling. I can look at stress, home price, trend data, and form a view as to where things might go based on modelling. But of course, it's only modelling. And it takes an hour for a conversation, either via Zoom or phone. And there is a fee involved simply because there's quite a lot of work to do to put it together. And I'm booking about 3 to 5 weeks ahead. If you go to the blog, there's a link in the comments below to the blog. You can contact me via the blog for information if you'd like to have a one-to-one conversation. And let me just also say that if I don't get to all the postcodes today, because we quite often get quite a lot of requests for individual postcode data, if you want information about one postcode, I can provide you the one sheet summary. If you contact me via the blog, again, it will take a few days for me to sort of ship those out because we get quite a few requests. But if you do miss out on the live show tonight, you can still get the information. And it's quite relevant because it gives you quite a rich view as to what's going on at the moment. So let's progress into the mortgage stress conversation. And I think a good place to start that conversation actually is to just look at the RBA model. They put this model up this week, which basically said when you think about the spectrum of household financial stress, you go from the budget pressures at the mild end right the way through to missing payments into insolvency. And, I measure stress at the mild end because my definition is essentially one where we are looking at cash flow, money in, money out. And the point about the cash flow is that if you actually end up with more money going out than coming in, eventually you have a problem. Now, that problem doesn't necessarily hit straight away, but it does hit over time. So when I talk about stress, there are many definitions that are different, from 30% of income or taxable income or underwriting metrics. So it goes right back to what the RBA said. There's that continuum. But we define stress in cash flow terms, money in, money out. So if households have more outgoings, that's excluding one-off discretionary items like holidays and things like that. Then income, we define them as stressed. If they have a mortgage, they're in mortgage stress. If renting, they have a rental stress problem. Investors also can have a cash flow pressure problem. So we talk to them as stressed investors. And we can aggregate the data to look at the total financial stress across the whole household pool in one particular area. We can look at both the percentage of households and the count. The count is a better measure, I think, because the measure essentially is looking at where the big numbers are. And frankly, where the big numbers are is the important conversation more broadly to the economy. And just going back to the RBA model again, the thing to understand is this is a time question too. From budget pressures through to missing payments through to insolvency, you're looking at 2 to 3 years or maybe more. And again, in the US, after the global financial crisis, it was 2013 before real insolvencies hit. So the time dimension is really important to understand too. People can keep on for a certain period of time, but eventually they get into some difficulty and just jump for joy. Thank you very much. Really. Well, the doggies will appreciate the doggy biscuits. So thank you for that. That's absolutely great. Okay, so having sort of laid the foundation, what we can quickly do is go into the discussion on financial pressure. And the RBA did put some information out last week. And you can look at the show I made earlier on household financial pressures and RBA propaganda, because I went through that presentation and picked it apart, saying, well, they're making some really interesting assumptions. One of the most critical ones was they only looked at variable rate loans, and they were using securitized data, and they were also not looking at total flows out, they were looking at the ones through the HEM, which of course is a very basic measure. So there was a bunch of reasons why the RBA information wasn't necessarily as powerful as it should have been. And as Av Dowd says, my house insurance is up 29%. Car insurance 29%, house insurance 32%, army pension up 5%. Yeah, that's the pincer movement that a lot of people are seeing. And interestingly, the fact of the matter is that many people are just saying in real terms, we don't see any of the benefits. In fact, if you look at it from a net income perspective, households are in many cases now in a worse position than they were 10, 12, 15 years ago. And that tax take issue that I mentioned earlier on is a really, really big issue. And just to underscore, the tax take has risen because, of course, what's happened is that the tax bands have been frozen for a long period of time, and then they took away the low tax offsets. So what that means is that people are actually being sucked into the tax machine and paying a lot more. And by the way, if you compare that to corporate taxation over the last 15 years has gone backwards relative to the income from households. So households are paying more and more and more to the government. And of course, the government's making some big spending commitments like the defense commitments and other things in the NDIS. Well, who's paying for it? The taxpayers. So with that thought in the back of our mind, let's then look at the mortgage stress for the month of November. And this is based on my modeling. So basically, the first thing is that rental stress has gone much higher. It's now 73.5% of households, never been higher. This is a real disaster for many people in the rental sector, and we'll see the implications of that. The mortgage stress is also higher. More than half of households now with a mortgage are actually finding the cash flow pressure is a real problem. Comparing it with back in February before COVID at 32%, it's gone through the roof. And of course, the RBA continues to say, well, the income ratio to payments on mortgages is 180 something. But of course, that's understating because they divide it by all households. So it should multiply by 3 to get a better view. Now, quickly, this is just the top line view. I'm not going to go through a lot of detail simply because I've gone through it in the earlier show, but just to highlight the fact that mortgage stress has risen specifically in Tasmania, Victoria, Western Australia, the ACT and the Northern Territory over the last month. It did ease back very slightly in a couple of other spaces, and it's pretty much line ball from where it was last month. But the rental stress has gone up higher, and you can see there we go, New South Wales, Tasmania, the Western Australia, and the total is higher. Investor stress is also higher, particularly in the ACT and New South Wales. I think the ease back in rentals is probably part of the reason why the rental stress in the ACT is a problem. And overall financial stress is higher, so 49.86% of households have some sort of cash flow pressure, irrespective of their property owning status. And that translates, if you look at the way it works, into 4.8 million households out of 9.7 million households who have a cash flow problem. And of course, the point there is that the other 50% or thereabouts are doing fine. So not everybody's in difficulty, but what we see is that a significant proportion of households have some significant issues. And you can quickly look at it by the different segments as well. So you can see there that from a mortgage stress perspective, young growing families, a lot of first-time buyers there, and those on the urban fringe have the highest. For the rental stress, a lot of first-generation Australians, the multicultural establishment, and also the more mature, stable families. But you can see that the numbers are high pretty much across the board. The investor stress is highest amongst exclusive professionals and young influence because they've got a higher proportion of investment properties, many of whom are finding it difficult. And in some cases, they're selling some of those investment properties. And overall financial stress, highest amongst young growing families and amongst the battling urban. So that gives you a bit of a flavour as to the overall story. And again, I won't go through this in detail, but just to highlight that, if you look down the mortgage stress concentration, this is by households, you can see that Liverpool and Roxburgh Park, and then Toowoomba in Queensland, and Tapping in Western Australia, and Campbelltown, and then Tarnett, Narre Warren, Pakenham, and all in Victoria. Now, a lot of those high growth corridors, lots of new properties, a lot of recent purchases. Then you've got some regional areas, things like Ballarat, where there's an issue, Toowoomba, of course, as I highlighted in Queensland. And then you can go back to Berwick and Derrimut and Cranbourne and Camborne. All those with high concentrations of relatively recently purchased properties, often homeland packages, high growth corridors, highly leveraged. The rental stress is pretty much where it was last month, with Melbourne and Toowoomba and Liverpool and Wentworthville at the top there, Campbelltown as well, and also some up in Queensland like Southport, places like that. And also Ipswich in Queensland, I keep coming back to that. Again, you find some of those areas are really up against it. And even the Central Coast at Gosford is on the list there. For the stressed investors, you can see that the centre of Melbourne is an issue. Then you've got some interesting areas like Riverstone, which is sort of further out, but even places like Randwick and Clovelly, and then Wentworthville and Coomera and Narrabeen. So it's quite varied, but the truth is that investor stress is pretty concerning. And then, of course, you've got financial stress, which is the overall top level. So you can see that Toowoomba up in Queensland, Liverpool, Tarn in Victoria, Campbelltown, Roxburgh Park, Cranbourne, Dermont, and then the centre of Melbourne is where you start seeing it. Get on the list, you've got Wentworthville, Mount Druitt, Ballarat, Ipswich, Labrador, Blacktown, Tapping, and then some Queensland areas like Belwood Park and Coomera. So that's the overall story. Not a good story. The numbers are going up, the concentration is going up, but it really does start to tell a significant problem in terms of what's going to happen. Now, remember I said to you that the timing question is really important. And so I also am now modeling prospective defaults. And so this last chart here is actually trying to get at where are the likely default levels. So again, I've sorted it by the risk of default being the highest over the next 12 months. So you can see places like Cranbourne, Mandurah in Western Australia, Tarneit in Victoria, Armidale in Western Australia, Roxburgh Park in Victoria, Gosford in New South Wales, Bundaberg in Queensland, and Toowoomba in Queensland as well. So you can see there that there are some areas where defaults are a bit of a problem, to put it mildly. Now, of course, the other way we can look at this is to look at the maps. And the point about the maps is that they show you the relative concentration. And, to my mind, if I look at, this happens to be the map for New South Wales, you can see a significant set of footprints here with closer into the eastern suburbs, a lot of blue. So that means that there's very little levels of stress. But as you go up through the yellows and into the oranges and the rents, you start to see a different story. So if we pull out, this is the New South Wales picture just coming on there, you can see that Liverpool pops out there, Warwick Farm, places like that, Chipping Norton. And as you pull out further, you can see that there are other areas to the west where there are some significant issues. So we still have the ring of fire, as I call it, but there's still some pressure closer in. And if we were to go to another postcode, let's go to Melbourne, as I sometimes do. We can go there and just look at Melbourne. So again, the same old story. If you look in the centre of Melbourne, things are not too bad. But as you begin to pull out, what you discover is that there's actually a bit more of a problem area, and you start seeing some of the red areas coming in, both over towards the Point Cook area, and then as you pull out further to the north, and also down there beyond Greater Dandenong. And if you pull out even further, we still see the Ballarat problem here as well. So you can see that there are considerable hotspot areas where things are actually definitely in difficulty. Remember, I'm looking at counts here. This is the size of the problem. And, if we go into another area, if I go to Perth, for example, what we're seeing there is that whilst prices have risen in Perth, we are starting to see away from some of those central areas where things are not too bad. Like North Perth is doing pretty well, West Perth. But if you then go to the north up towards Scarborough and above, or if you go to the south, or if you go higher up still, like Wanneroo, you can see that we start to see some significant pain points. And the interesting observation here with these maps is that it shows you that, you can have some areas where really things are not particularly a problem, but other areas where things are going off the boil quite quickly. Rockingham is an interesting one where, of course, they're planning to put some significant investment in with submarine bases and things, so that might change. So the point about all of this modeling is that it shows you the differences. And the reason this is important, I keep coming back to this, is because you can't take an average view here. You can't talk about average households, which is what the RBA tends to do, because, of course, it's so different in different locations. So what I try to do is to get really down into the detail to really understand the way that it actually works. And the best way to sort of move that conversation forward then is to have a little bit of a look at the information from my modeling. And this is the way I present the information. This is actually the centre of Sydney, postcode 2000. And the reason this is quite powerful is because it sort of shows you a lot of interesting information in one place. And this is the modeling that I produce every month. So if I look at this particular postcode, you can firstly see the disposable monthly income. Now, this is after the tax, after the other things you have to pay. So this is what you've actually got to service your mortgage and everything else. And then what I do is I look at the mix of households in terms of those borrowing outright, those owning outright, borrowing and renting. This is from the census information, adjusted for the latest information that I've got from my surveys. We've also got the stress information, so we need to know where the cash flow is, where it's not. We've got some information about the mix of properties, so the houses or units, the occupation numbers, the ratio, the people ratio. This is quite important. So when this goes up, you see families. If it goes down, it's more likely to be individuals. And the vacancy rates as well. That's from the census. We get the gross and investment yield. We also have the taxable income from the ATO and from the census. And we take all the information and then we can make some estimations about where prices might be going over that. Sorry, that's Meteor having a scratch in the carpet. She's making her bed in the carpet at the moment. So if you hear a noise in the background, that's what she's doing. She's now gone back in her bed. So hopefully she'll simmer down again. There you go. The doggies are still there. Oh, yes, it's a tough life being a dog, isn't it? Hey? Okay, so as I was saying, you then have some information about the scenario. So that's sort of the way the model works. And it's updated each month. You can subscribe on Patreon if you want to get the full information each month. Now, I had a few requests before the show started for particular postcodes, and this is actually via the YouTube chat from earlier on. So somebody asked for Penrith. So I'm going to go through that one now as the next one. And the Penrith story is quite interesting. We've got 20,000 households, of which 34% are borrowing and 41% are renting. We've got 47% in mortgage stress. We've got 56% in rental stress. We've got some investor stress, and we've got some financial stress as well, 42%. So scenarios, we see the best case, if everything works really well, maybe we see a short rise, but otherwise probably not. And interestingly, of course, if you look at the mix of properties here, 65% of houses, 20% of units. The people ratio is high, so it's more to do with households rather than individuals. The vacancy rates are 7%, quite high. Gross investment yield's 3, but the net investment yield is underwater, minus 0.4%. And if you look at the taxable income, 76,000 from the ATL, 86,000 from the household. Now, what you quite often find is that in some postcodes, the household census information is quite a lot higher than the individual because, of course, you have multiple incomes going into a particular household. And the interesting work from CBA recently and from other people have assumed 2 incomes. Not all households have 2 incomes, of course. So that's why that sometimes tells you something quite important. Disposable monthly income is therefore just over 5,400, of which, on average, 45.6% is going on the average mortgage at 2,195, and 35.5% or 1,944 going on the average rent. So that's pretty horrendous. And it is worth just understanding that the story here is that households really do have some issues when it comes to just managing their cash flow. And I sometimes wonder whether the RBA really understands what's really going on. Now, let me just cut back to the scenarios and talk a little bit about the, let's go there, go there, go there. There we go. Yeah. Talking about the scenarios, because my scenarios are just a way of exploring the future. They're not predictions. They're not future expectations. But what they're trying to do is to get at what may be going on and what might be. It's more a way of thinking about what the futures might look for. They run from today onwards. And here we are. Here's the scenario information. So I have three scenarios. The best scenario case is what I call the Goldilocks zone. So let's assume that the rates stay at 4.35% and fall away next year. The RBA is saying 2025 before that happens, but we'll see. Back into band in the middle of 2025 or something. Bearing in mind they're now at 2.5% target rather than the band. Inflation eases ahead of RBA expectations. Wages rise faster. We don't get a recession. And the migration stays well above average because, of course, strong migration tends to drive the momentum. The base case is a soft landing where we see rates going slightly higher, 4.6%, which means you see mortgage rates slightly higher. And they stay high until 23, 24, but inflation sticks up around and we don't get a recession in Australia, but migration does fall away. The third is with the nightmare scenario where we see rates rise even more strongly, and higher for longer is not where it is, it's higher for longer. Plus, mortgage rates therefore go even higher and stay high in 24 along with inflation. Then we see the wages growth really stall even further and we get a recession locally, rates then fall quickly, migration drops below average, but the damage is done. So those are the way that the scenarios tend to work. So if I then go on to the next one that I was asked about before the show, I was asked for 2515, which is, of course, well known to me, the Thurrool area where I used to live. And here you can see that it's a different story in terms of just a smaller count, 4,300 households there. Quite a few own outright, but 41% are borrowing, 90% are renting. You can see there that 81% are houses. There are some units and a few others. Others include things like living over shops. The vacancy rate was relatively high because you had some holiday homes and things in the area at the time of the census, but the people ratio is quite high. So effectively what you're seeing there is, families, not just individuals. And if you look at the information relating to tax, ATO said 105,000 per individual, 125,000 per household. If we look at implications of that from a disposable monthly income perspective, 7,200 on average, 43% going on the typical mortgage at 3,120 and 37.9 going on the average rent. From a scenario perspective, there is a scenario of small property price rises over the next 2 or 3 years. This is a cumulative view of 2% over 3 years, but it's more likely, I think, we're going to see some further falls. Prices have, of course, fallen from their peaks in this area. And in many regional areas, we are seeing some significant downward momentum at the moment. I was also asked for Shell Harbour. So we're going to go there now. This is, again, down in the Illawarra. And then 10,900 households, 40.9% are borrowing and 25% are renting. We've got 56% in mortgage stress, 66% in rental stress, and overall financial stress at 44%. Looking at the mix, 77% are houses, small number of units, some other types of property. Again, people ratio indicates houses with families rather than just individuals. Lower vacancy rate at 4.7%. The gross investment yield is 3.5. Net investment yield is nothing. And looking at the taxable income, 79,000 versus 97,000 for the census, which means we have a disposable monthly income around 5,900, with 43.5 going on the typical mortgage borrowing at 2,600 and 39.2% at 2,343 going on the typical rent. From a scenario perspective, well, there is a small scenario of property price rises on my best case scenario for both units and houses, but the base case is a small fall over the next 3 years. So we'll see how that turns out. And then I was also asked to do 3850, which is Sale, down in the Latrobe area, 6,500 households with a third borrowing, a third renting. Mortgage stress is quite high at 76 and 61 for rental stress. The houses is 85% few units. The people ratio is a bit lower at just over 2. The vacancy rate's 9. And here we have a gross investment yield of 2.9, a net investment yield minus 1.2. One of the things you'll notice about Victoria is a lot of net investment yields are in negative terms. That's one of the reasons why we see a lot of listings of old investment properties at the moment. The taxable income, 76,000 for the typical individual from the ATO. The household census is 69, so we don't get as many double incomes in that area. So the disposable monthly income is lower at 4,751, and the typical mortgage at 32 or 1,560 or 29.4 at 1,395. And looking at the scenarios, well, there is, best case scenario, a very small rise over the next 3 years of about 3%, but more likely, more significant falls. And the last one I was asked to do before I came on the air was 2200. And we'll do that one. That's actually Bankstown in Sydney. 15,000 households there with 30% borrowing and 46% renting, a lot of renters. 29% in mortgage stress, but 89% in rental stress. Some stress invests as a result of that as well, and so the financial stress is pretty high. We're looking at 38% of houses, a lot of units, and other types of property. People ratio is including to show some families as well as individuals. And the gross investment yield's 3.4. The net investment yield is minus 0.4, so a lot of investors underwater. Taxable income, 63,000 from the ATO and 72,000 from the household census. Disposable monthly income, 4,714, with 50% ooch going on the typical mortgage, 2,368, and 43% going on the typical rent. That is a very high number. And again, look, there is a scenario that says you might get a small rise over 3 years if everything goes well, but the base case and worst case is a fall in property values from this point. So we'll see how that goes. So with that, having done some of the early work there, 4817 was asked for, so we'll put that one into the machine. And thank you for the super chat. So this is Koan. Yep, agreed. And looking at that, we've got 11,400 households, 45% of borrowing, very high proportion of people with mortgages there, 32% renting. The mortgage stress numbers are lower than some other areas, which is interesting. And a lot of them are houses, 91%. The people ratio indicates families rather than individuals. And the gross investment yield is 4.3. The net investment yield is 1. Average income from the ATO, 73,940. Via the census, 97,032. And that translates to a disposable monthly of 6,100, with 29.6 going on the typical mortgage and 26.8 going on the typical rent. So they're actually doing quite well relative to other parts of the country. As a result of that, there is an expectation potentially of some significant price rises over the next 2 or 3 years on the cumulative best case scenario, up 19 or 16% for houses and units. The base case is a pretty much flat story over the next 3 years. The worst case is obviously a fall. So that gives you a little bit of a sense of that one. Eric said, can I do 3020? I can indeed. And the interesting thing is you start looking at different postcodes, you can see just how different some of these are. This is Sunshine West in Melbourne, 16,000 households, a third borrowing, a third renting. The mortgage stress is relatively low, but the rental stress is 72%, very high. We see that 76% of houses, some units and other types of property. People ratio is talking about families rather than individuals. And the gross investment yield, 3.4. Net investment yield is negative 0.2. So we do have a little bit of issue there with some of those investment properties. Average taxable income from the ATO, 63,000 versus 74,000 for the census. And that translates to a disposable monthly income about 4,800, with 43% going on the typical mortgage at just over $2,000 and 35% going on the typical rent at 1,694. And looking at the scenarios, well, the best case scenario is a small rise over the next 3 years. That's because the mortgage stress level is relatively low at the moment. It's contained. but the base case and the worst case would be a bit of a fall in terms of values. Okay, let's see what else we can see in other questions. Right, did that one. I've done 2200. You asked earlier in the show, and I did it. So there you go. We aim to please. Let's see what else we can find in terms of other postcodes. Okay, here's one. 3199, please. Yes. Interesting, it's just next door. So this is Frankston in Melbourne. And here we've got 23,000 households, of which 40% are borrowing and 32% are renting. We've got stress at 72% and rental stress at 72%. We've got 77% of houses, some units and other types of property. The people ratio is a little lower, so some individuals and some households. The gross investment yield is 3.3, net investment yield is minus 0.7, so underwater again there on average. And looking at the taxable income, 73,000 from the ATO and 79,000 from the household census. So not so many double incomes, we think, in that area. So that means the disposable income is around 5,200 a month, with 42% going on the typical mortgage and 33% going on the typical rent, with around 1,745. And just in terms of scenarios, you can see there that the best case scenario is a very, very small potential rise. But the base case and the worst case is a more significant fall, as you might expect. And as I said earlier on, a lot of the Melbourne stuff is looking pretty sick, really. Now, Ben's asked for 2080, which is Mount Ku-ring-gai. Now, I should highlight that this particular one has a very low count. So we need to be a little cautious with this particular one. And I'll take that off screen because it's covering up some of the information. But nevertheless, with those low counts, got to be cautious. Nevertheless, we aren't seeing much in the way of stress. A lot of people are borrowing. The mixture of houses is mostly houses rather than units. We're seeing the people ratio sort of family rather than individuals. And the gross investment yield is about 4. The net investment yield is positive 0.6. The ATO said 88,000 versus the household census 126,000. That's going to be an example where you're going to see potentially multiple incomes going to support the household. But the first month income around 6,600, with 47% going on the typical borrowing on mortgage at 3,178 and 42.6, 2,830 going on the typical rent. But again, I must caveat it, it's a very low count. So with the low count ones, if it's below 1,000 households, it is really quite unclear as to whether that's as accurate. It should be plus or minus 5% typically. Once you get above 1,000, the accuracy really rises quite quickly. And above 3,000, it's 0.1%. Here's another one, 3073. And on this particular one, 3073 is Reservoir in Victoria, 21,000 in the postcode, with 29% owning outright, 33% borrowing and 37% renting. Stress is quite high at 66, 67% respectively on mortgage and rental stress. We are seeing a 63% measure for houses, some units, quite a few other types of properties there, according to the census. And the people ratio is above 2, so some families as well as individuals. Gross investment yield is 3.1, net investment yield is minus 0.2%. And again, I keep coming back to this, Melbourne not doing great on investment yield returns. From the ATO, 69,000 versus the census, 80,000. Disposable monthly income, just over 5,400, with 44.1% going on the typical mortgage at 2,383 and 33.2%, 1,794 going on the typical rent. And looking at the scenarios, well, you know, if everything works perfectly, there's a small increase over 3 years, but the base case and worst case would suggest that both houses and units are likely to fall over the months and years ahead. And interestingly, of course, a few reports have suggested that the latest increase in the interest rates have really started now to create some pressures on households. Okay, here's one. 4274. Which I don't have. That's interesting. Oh no, hang on, 4272. Sorry, I put it in wrong. Try again. You have to blame owner operator error for that. Tamarind Mountain. Okay. So in this particular one, we have 3,200, so a reasonably accurate survey. 44% borrowing, 14% are renting. A lot of people in mortgage stress at 63%, and rental stress is also high too. And that's putting a bit of a downward pressure on future trajectory of prices. So the best case is a 5.8% over 3 years for houses, slightly less for units, but the base and worst case is a loss. 93% of houses, small number of units there. The people ratio is showing families as well as individuals, and the investment yield is 4.6. The net investment yield is flat. From a taxable income perspective, 76,000 from the ATO and 78,000 from the census. And looking at disposable monthly income, you've got 4,400 coming in, with 48.7% going on the average mortgage at 2,160, and 47.2 going on the average rent at just over $2,000. So again, we see some interesting variations. James said, could I grab 4014? You sure can. That's Virginia in Queensland. And there we've got just under 5,000 households, with 23% owning outright, 48%, that's one of the highest so far, borrowing, 27% renting. We've got the mortgage stress at 72%, the rental stress at 55%, and overall financial stress above half. The mix of houses versus units, 91% houses, so mostly houses, a few units and things there. The people ratio, again, is showing households rather than individuals. And gross investment yields 4.9, net investment yields 1.5. Taxable income on average, 83,000. The household census at 122,000. And the disposable monthly income, just over 7,000, with 34% going on the typical mortgage at 2,576, and 30% going on the typical rent. From a house price perspective, there is an opportunity on the best case scenario for further rises, both in houses and units, but the base case and worst case would suggest potential falls. So it does depend a little bit on where things go. Okay, Ben asked for 2075 St Ives. Can do that. Okay, St Ives, 7,700 households, 45% are borrowing, 15% are renting. There is some mortgage stress at 35. 88% of those in rental stress are actually having some significant issues. And the mix of property, 70% houses, some units and other types. People ratio is sort of talking about households rather than individuals, I think. The gross investment yield is at 3.7. Net investment yield is 0.2. Average taxable, 129,000 from the ATO, 154,000 from the census. Translates to a disposable monthly of about 7,800, with 53.6% going on the average mortgage, 4,200, and 44.5% at 3,488 going on the average rent. So you can see there that because of the high home prices in the area, people are quite highly leveraged, despite the fact their incomes are quite a lot higher than what we've seen elsewhere. And looking at the price scenarios, even the best case scenario is suggesting over the next 3 years a slide rather than a rise in values. Okay, what else have we got? Rick asked for 4341. Which is Laidley Heights in the Moreton Bay area in the SA3 of Ipswich. So here we have nearly 6,000 households with 49.7 borrowing, 21% renting, 87% in mortgage stress, 75% in rental stress. So that's very high count of financial stress. The mix is mostly houses, 96%, and the people ratio would indicate families rather than individuals. Gross investment yields 4.5, net investment yield just positive at 0.2. Average taxable 67,000 from the ATO and 74,000 from the census. So the disposable typically around $4,800 a month, with 37%, 1,800 going on the mortgage, and 32, 1,570 going on the typical rent. And looking at the home price scenarios, well, there is still some upside in the best case scenario, but on the base and worst case, a bit of a fall. Okay, what else have we got? Here's one, 2902, which is Canberra. In Canberra, 6,200 households, 45% borrowing, 21% renting, a lot of mortgage stress, quite a lot of rental stress, and 84% of houses, some units, other types of property. Again, people ratios would suggest households rather than individuals. 4% for the gross investment yields, 0.2 for the net investment yield. The taxable, 85,000 from the ATO, 114,000 from the census. So that would probably suggest two incomes going in. Disposable monthly around 7,300, with 32% or 2,400 going on the typical mortgage and 27.1% or 1,993 going on the typical rent. And looking at the price scenarios, well, there's a small cumulative rise of just over 1% over 3 years. Of course, that's not inflation adjusted, so in real terms going backwards. But the base and worst case scenario would suggest falls over the next 2 or 3 years. Okay, whoops. Steve said 4053, which I'm happy to do. So this is McDowell. And I'll just take you off screen so we can see all the data. Okay. So here we've got 19,000 households, 40% are borrowing, 35% are renting, with 46% in mortgage stress and 90% in rental stress. So the overall financial stress for households is about 57. We've got 76% of houses and some units and other types of property there. You've got a people ratio above 2, so that's including some households. Gross investment yield is 4.6, net investment yield 1.1. The taxable is 83,000 from the ATO and 111,000 from the census. And that translates to disposable monthly of about 6,958, with 35% going on the typical mortgage and 29% going on the typical rent. And looking at the scenarios, best case scenario is a rise, cumulative of 7% over 3 years, slightly less for units. Tends to be the case. And the base case and worst case is a fall. And if I may just pause here to remind you, please, to like the posts on the show here. It is a way of getting the information out to a wider audience, of course, because YouTube uses the likes to spread the word as well as comments, but likes are actually pretty important. So please do like the post, and would appreciate that, seeing as we've got quite a few on tonight. Would be really, oops, I pushed that button. Get rid of that button again. You probably know who I am. Right, let's go back to the analysis. Matthew said, can I have 4152? Give it a go, see whether I can get that one for you. 4152. This is Camp Hill in the Brisbane area, 18,600 with 43% borrowing, 27% renting. We've got 86% in mortgage stress and 68% in rental stress. We've got 72% of houses, a few units there. People ratio getting above 2. And gross investment yield is 4.3, net investment yield positive 0.4. Taxable income from the ATO 94,000 and from the census 120,000. Disposal monthly income 7,700 and something, with 34% going on the typical mortgage at 2,640 and 28.8% at 2,243 going on the typical rent. And the scenario is best case, small rise over 3 years of about 7%, and falls for the base and worst case scenario. Brad says, can we look at Rockhampton? We'll give that one a go. It's 4700. $7,000 households, 30% borrowing, 36% renting. Very low levels of mortgage stress, but quite a lot of rental stress in the area. 82% of houses, some units, and quite high vacancies in the area. So that could be Airbnb or it could be holiday homes and things like that. Gross investment yield 4.7, net investment yield positive 0.7. Average taxable 85,000. Average household from the census 72,000. The disposal monthly at 4,710, with a third going on the typical mortgage at 1,560 and 28% going on the typical rent at 1,320. And from a scenario perspective, 12% over 3 years for houses and 10.3% over units, best case scenario, but falls in the other two scenarios. So Matthew said 4152, and thanks for this. Thanks for that. Really appreciate it. Super Chat brought your request to my attention ahead of a few other people. So it works. It goes into a separate queue, you see, so I see it immediately, which is quite helpful. Okay. Camp Hill. Have I done Camp Hill? Not sure whether I have. I'm going to do it again anyway. I don't keep a list of all the ones I've done because it's a bit complicated to try and do that. So I apologize if I'm duplicating, but anyway, it's always worth going over the information. 18,600, 43% borrowing, 27% renting. We've got 86% and 68% of mortgage and rental stress. We've got 72% of houses. We've got a people ratio above 2, so that suggests we've got households rather than individuals. 4.3 and 0.4 gross and net investment yields. 94 versus 120 for the taxable incomes. Disposal monthly 7,773, 34% versus 28% going to the mortgage versus the rent at 2,640 and 2,234. And looking at the cumulative positive in the best case scenario over 3 years, not necessarily in the other cases. Thank you for the super chat. Really appreciate it. Okay. 2578. 2578. It will be 25. I'd ask you please not to keep asking me for the same one again. If you've put it up, I will get to it. But if you just keep asking me again, it doesn't necessarily mean that I'm going to get to any sooner. It just confuses my chat. So it'll be quite good to just hold off if you've put it in already. I will try and work down the list. Okay, this is a low count postcode. It's in the Southern Highlands in New South Wales. And we've got 28% borrowing, 30% renting, but 58% owning outright. So a lot of people, of course, mortgage-free and therefore doing quite well. 66% in mortgage stress, 100% in rental stress. Again, low count, so be careful. 96% in houses, small number of units. And the people ratio is lower, so that's probably going to include some individuals as well as some families. The gross investment yield is 3, net investment yield is negative 0.2. Average taxable from the ATO, 82,000 versus 67,000 from the census. And disposable monthly income, just over 4,200, with 51% going on the typical mortgage and 46% going on the typical rent. Scenarios, best case, hardly anything. And the worst case and base case, some prospective falls ahead. But we will see. Okay, Shell wanted 4552. Try and put that one in. This is Cameroon in the Sunshine Coast hinterland with 3828 and 30% of borrowing, 16% of renting, 45% in mortgage stress, 72% in rental stress, and almost all houses in the area. People ratios 1.99, so some individuals as well as households, and 4.6% gross yield, 0.3% net yield, but still positive. ATO said 79,000, the household census said 65,000 for the taxable income. And the monthly income from a disposable income perspective is currently around 4,100, with 49% going on the typical mortgage and 44% at 1,843 going on the typical rent. And we're also seeing, well, best case scenario, there's a little bit of upside, but the base and the worst case potential falls. So it does depend on what the RBA chooses to do and what happens to migration, etc., etc. Drone I asks for 2747. Warrington is the postcode, and that's in Penrith. 19,000 with 47% borrowing, so a lot of new development there, of course, as you'd expect. 36% renting, 35% in mortgage stress, 59% in rental stress. The count is 76% with houses and quite a lot of units as well. People ratio is back above 2, so that's going to be more households. The gross investment yield is 3.3. Net investment yield is minus 0.3. Average taxable, 72,000 versus 100,000 for the census. Disposable monthly income, 6,200 with 42% on the typical mortgage at 2,640 and 31.8% at 1,993 on the typical rent. And scenario as well, the best case scenario, there's a bit of an upside potential if things go really well, but also risks the downside if not. Okay, let's see what else we've got. Right. Down the list. Yes. Don't forget to give Martin a big thumb. Hit it. Thank you very much. MCM. Appreciate it. Just getting myself down the list. Okay. Now, you said I made a mistake on the first postcode request, so I posted correctly the second time. And that was what, why. Now, can I find what, why? That's the question. If I can't, you may need to put it in for a third time just so I've got it. Oh, dear. This chat's getting crazy, 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 crazy. Okay. I can't find what, why at the moment. What, why? Can you put it back in? In the meantime, I'm going for the short boy. 4077 will be nice. Thanks for the super chat. So we're talking Durack in Queensland. And we've got 12,300 households with 29% borrowing and 53% renting, with 97.5% in mortgage stress and 89.9% in rental stress. A lot of households in financial stress there. 70% are houses, some units and other types of property. We've got the people ratio up in the sort of the household range rather than the individual range. 4.2% for the gross investment yield, 0.7% for the net investment yield. The taxable income on average 59,000 for the ATO and 69,000 from the census, which gives us a disposal monthly around 4,900, with 37.2 1820 going on the typical rent mortgage, and 34.6 at 1694 going on the typical rent. Household scenarios, not a lot happening really, even in the best case scenario, and risks to the downside. And I suspect that's a combination of the income levels and also the amount of stress that's in there at the moment. Okay, why did you put it back in? What, why? Aha, here we go. 2481. Got it. We got there in the end, eh? Okay. 2481. This is in a place called Suffolk Park on the north coast, around the Richmond area. So 5,100 households with 28% borrowing, 36% renting. We've got the stress levels at 82% for the mortgage and 81% for the rental. Financial stress is high too. 68% houses, some units and other types of property there. People ratio is lower, so that's some individuals as well as households, I think. Gross investment yield, 3.1. Net investment yield, minus 0.1. Average taxable, 83 versus 93 for the census. Typical monthly income, 6,085, with 47% going on the typical mortgage and 49% going on the typical rent at 2,860 and 2,990 respectively. Interestingly, the rent's higher than the mortgage. And looking at the scenarios, well, not a lot of upside really. Okay. Thanks you for insightful channel and Q&As. Much respect. Merry Christmas. Thank you, Shell. Appreciate it. Thanks for the super chat there. And what why who's has now said Byron Bay 4281. Byron Bay. I think Byron Bay is 4281. Need to check that postcode, I think. Certainly it's not coming up as Byron Bay in my data, sorry. Okay. I'm being flooded now. Oh dear, oh dear, oh dear. Okay. 6110, Perth one. First Perth one tonight, I think. 610. So that's in Huntingdale, in the southeast of Perth. And we've got 16,200 households with 54% borrowing, 25% renting, with 43% in mortgage stress and 71% in rental stress. We have overall financial stress at 46%. We've got 89% houses and a few units there as well. The people ratio is a little above the 2, so including some households. The gross investment yield is 4%, and the net investment yield is flat. Looking at the taxable income, 72,000 versus 84,000. And looking at the disposable monthly income, 4,954 with 42% ooch going on the typical mortgage at just over $2,000 and the typical rental payment at 31% or 1,570. Looking at the scenarios, the best case is a further rise in prices. The base case, not so much, and the worst case, a bit of a fall away. Okay, let's go here. Drew asked for 3,944, and it said, has it changed since the golf course? We'll see. I don't know. I suspect this is Portsea. I can take that off screen so you can see it. It's a low, very, very low count. The problem with this one is it's such a low count, it's, hardly worth exploring. 20% borrowing, mostly own outright, few renters, no mortgage stress to speak of, mostly houses. The net investment yields are pretty poor, but some of them are probably going to be part-time lets and those sorts of things, so that's maybe not surprising. Look at the average taxable, 240,000 versus the household 228,000, so a lot of disposable income. But then those with a mortgage are paying quite a lot, 43 and 36. But I have to tell you that the low count makes it a bit of a difficult conversation. It's, maybe not accurate. So looking at the scenarios, best case is still significant rises, whereas the base and worst case is a bit of a fall. Six oh 6065 being asked for. There we go. Get rid of that so I can see it. Okay, so this is in Wanneroo, tapping, which of course is one of my stressed areas. 24,000 households with 63% borrowing. That's as high as it's been, isn't it? Some renting, 17%. 80% in mortgage stress, 80% in rental stress. Financial stress at 67% is very high. Mostly houses and above 2, so a lot of families rather than individuals. Gross investment yield is 3.8, net investment yield is flat. 78,000 average taxable, 110,000 household. So again, you can see multiple incomes going on the mortgage. And that gives you a disposable monthly of around 6,800, with 35% going on the typical mortgage at 2,400, 29% going on the typical rent of about 1,900. And looking at the scenarios, small rises, best case scenario over the next 3 years, but the base and worst case is a bit of a fall. Okay. 6230. Now this is Carey Park in the Stirling district down towards Bunbury. 18,000 households. This is Western Australia, of course. 40% borrowing, 33% renting. Mortgage stress at 63, rental stress at 82. 80% houses, some units and other types of property. People ratio is just above 2, and the gross investment yield is at 3.9, the net investment yield at 0.2, and the individual taxable 81 versus 76 for the household census. Disposable monthly 5,100, with 35% going on the typical mortgage and 29%, 1,495, going on the typical rent. And looking at the scenarios, well, the best case is a bit of a rise, cumulatively 8% over 3 years for houses, but the base and worst case is a bit of a fall. That'll give you a bit of a flavour of what's going on there. Come on, Martin, pretty please. Byron Bay is 2481. Are you teasing me with 4281? Oh, sorry. I'm getting tired. This is quite a lot of concentration required to do all of this. Let's try this. It's in Byron. So I've got this as Suffolk Park rather than Byron Bay. For 2481. So I don't know. Anyway, I will just reprise this one, 5,100, with 28% going on the borrowing, 36% on the rent, 80% stress for mortgage and 81% for rental, 60% houses, some units, a lot of vacancies. That's part of Airbnb and holiday homes and things. The gross investment yield is 3, minus 0.1. Average taxable is 83,000. Average census from the household census is 93,000, giving a disposable income of just over 6,000, with 47% going on the mortgage and 49% going on the rent. Not much happening with values over the next scenarios other than on the downside. Okay. What else have we got? $4510, please. This is Caboolture, or how you ever pronounce that. Depends, I guess, on where you come from. 20,000 households, 38% borrowing, 38% renting, 20% in mortgage stress, 86% in rental stress. So rental stress is a problem. 83% of houses, some units and other types there. Again, the people ratio is suggesting higher than just individuals. 4.6% for gross, 0.9% for net investment yield. Taxable income, 62 from the ATO, 68 from the household census. Giving 43% on the typical monthly for the mortgage at 1906 and 36.6 at 1619 for the typical rent. And looking at the scenarios, well, there is an upside for the best case, but the base and worst is on the downside. All right. Ads. Ben is asking for 2556. Which is coming out as a Bringley in my models. So is that the same place? I have no idea. It's certainly in southwest Sydney. It's a low count, so it's probably a new development area, I suspect, which means, of course, that there's a bit of uncertainty about what's going on. I don't have much in the way of data as a result of that low count and the fact that it's relatively new. We do know that there's 675 houses in the area, according to the last data set. That's probably understating what's going on at the moment. And the gross investments at 3, net investments minus 2.4. Taxables around 90 to 95, and we're seeing 42 and 40 for the disposable monthly income, but with that low count, it's very hard to tell what's going on. And because the low count is there, the scenarios may not be very accurate too. Like I said, anything below 1,000, it's a bit dodgy really. So just bear that in mind. Don't take that as gospel, please. Okay. Well, we've got this 920 something. And I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to come back and just finish off a bit more of the presentation. And what we might then do is we've got a few more postcodes. We might cover off those towards the end. But I am conscious that people probably want to get away close to on time. So it's quite useful to be able to just sort of kick the conversation forward. The point I suppose I want to make is that there's a lot going on with regards to the markets and household finances. What I'm trying to do is to show you in this analysis that the story is that you've got to look very granularly at different things. But you can see a lot of households with significant pressures. Remember that disposable incomes in real terms are falling quite fast. And the point is that a lot of households are finding that it's now getting more and more difficult. So what are things that people should think about? So the first is it's important to have a cash flow. So we're seeing a few more people now building cash flows so that they can see the money coming in, money going out. I think it's really important to understand where the money's going. And there's some really good tools on the ASIC Money Smart website if you want to sort of build some cash flows. So understand where the money's going. Then you can prioritize. In some cases, what we are seeing people is dialing back on some of their expenditure. And, whether it's critical expenditure or not depends on your point of view. Health funding, for example, health insurance, or not going to see the doctor, or dental treatment. Now, I would argue some of those are pretty important, but at the moment, people are actually dialing them back. They're also spending less on food. They're also spending less on some of those subscriptions to streaming services. So there's a bunch of things that people are doing. The second point is that if you've got a mortgage and you are really in struggle street, just continuing to pay and pay and pay, because people will want to pay, they prioritize the housing. It's important to talk to your bank, and the banks do have schemes where they can help extend the mortgage over a longer period, go interest only, or do other things. So it is worth talking to your lender, but it is worth going in armed with the information about your cash flows, so that they've got a sort of a baseline on which to work with. The banks sometimes, though, will make recommendations for things that help the bank. extend the loan, but you'll be paying more interest over a longer period of time. And, that may be appropriate to get through a hard patch. But if, in fact, every month your cash flow is negative, then unless you can find a way of alleviating that, that's a problem. If you're in the rental sector, and of course rentals are still rising, even not quite as fast now, it's a real problem. And so what we are seeing is a number of households moving in with parents, moving in with other families, house sharing. We're seeing quite a lot of that in our surveys now. And in fact, that's reducing, in some places, the total household count, which is offsetting the rise from the migration, which is interesting. So if you're in the rental sector, harder to sort of work a way through. People are moving further out, are actually moving into cheaper accommodation, less salubrious accommodation sometimes. But nevertheless, we are seeing a rise in unsecured credit, buy now, pay later, credit cards, those sorts of things, as well as rating savings. And so you are building a sort of a debt problem. And so what I'm saying to people is, if you are actually in the situation where you have significant pressures, it's worth getting some decent advice. And I always recommend the National Debt Helpline. This is a government-backed service, of course, and the people here are actually paid to help and provide advice. That's 1-800-007-007, and that's a number to take a note of. I did show you earlier on that the statistics is showing that, in fact, more people are getting into difficulty, and as a result of that, the calls to helplines are actually rising. And Jason, thank you very much for the super chat. And you make the point, appreciate the like, banter, and info. Perhaps considering smashing the like button. Cost nothing. Stay well all. Thank you very much, Jason. And absolutely, please like the show, folks. It really does help to get the word out. And this is an important conversation, because what we're trying to do here is we're trying to help people make better decisions. Now, just in terms of if you want to get more information about what we do, and if you want to get access to this information, just to say that you can go to the DFA blog. There's the link there. And down on the blog, down at the bottom right, there's a little dialog box that you can send me a message. So if you want to get information about one particular postcode, you can send me a message and I'll send you the one-page chart that I showed earlier on. That's also the place to go if you want to contact me with regard to the one-on-one conversation. If you want a more detailed conversation, we can also do that. Of course, we do also have our Patreon program. In fact, we have a number of people supporting us via Patreon, always greatly appreciated. What I would say is, if you've signed up some time back and not renewed your credit card, you might have dropped off the list. So always worth checking to make sure that your Patreon subscription is up to date. And within that, I have a range of different membership levels, including access to the total data set. But the one that's actually giving you the overall set for what I've shown today is actually the $50 per month plus GST. And if you join and get that, you can get hold of the more than 2,000 postcodes, the data set that I've shown today. So I'll have a few people sign up for that. If that's something of interest, go across to Patreon there. See the link. It's patreon.com/digital finance analytics. And by the way, I also have PayPal if you want to make a one-off contribution to what we do here. It really is very helpful just in terms of keeping these on air. There is, of course, some expenditure involved in just keeping everything going. And I do try to use all the funding that I get to maintain the service and to do the modeling and keep the equipment up to date, etc., etc. So it is quite helpful. And I will also just finally say that next week we do have another show, and there will be an independent economist coming back on. We had him on a few weeks ago, and he'll be coming back to spend some more conversation time with us, talking about some of his work, and that'll be exciting. I'll put a link of things up before next week. The following week, there will be a show as well. That's on Boxing Day, and Tony LaCantra and I are going to have a Boxing Day fest. So that'll be quite fun as well. Bossman actually makes the point, your equipment isn't cheap. No, it's not, but it does make all the difference in terms of making a reliable show and a high quality show, and to do all the interactions that we do. It would be very, very difficult to do this without the investment I've made over the years. So, and again, it's partly thanks to the contributions I've received via the shows to help cover the costs of some of those things. Okay, well, we're pretty close to the end of the time. And just to say again, if you have missed out on getting a request, just send me a message in the DFA blog. And over the next few days, I will respond. I do get quite a sort of a flurry, but it is, of course, a matter of just my getting through the emails. Nick said it's a long time since we saw Harry Dent. Yes. Well, the reason for that is that, of course, Harry was calling a fall in the stock markets. He hasn't changed his tune. And so there was nothing really new to talk about. And of course, since then, markets have gone up again. So I didn't think it was that relevant to bring him back. If there are particular people that you'd like me to bring on, let me know. I'm happy to reach out and try and bring them back on. But I felt that Harry was less relevant. And of course, house prices have actually betrayed his expectations and some of my expectations because of the high migration and all the other stuff that's gone on with government intervention. So in a way, it's all sort of fallen that particular way at the moment. Anyway, I think we're pretty much done. So look forward to seeing you on the live show next week. And that'll be pretty interesting. I think we'll have a nice broad conversation about some of the economics. And in the meantime, of course, check out the recorded shows. I'm putting shows up very regularly now and trying to cover the various bases, including, of course, the cash issue, the regional banking inquiry, and of course, the household financial pressure issue, because it's a really, really, really important conversation to have. And, my view is it's very, very important that you take ownership of the cash flow pressures. Don't rely on central bankers to get you out of jail. Remember, their financial stability mantra is not necessarily going to help individual households, and some of those are actually in quite significant difficulty. And yes, Steve Van Meter. Yeah, that's a good idea, actually. I'll try and reach for Steve probably early in the new year, because he's been peddling his particular view for some time, and it'll be interesting to catch up with him. So he and I have had some good chats in the past, and no reason why we couldn't do it again. Anyway, I want to say thank you very much for spending some time with us. Hope it's been useful. And, the message is manage your cash flow carefully. Be conscious of the cash flow and make sure that you're making good decisions with regard to where you spend. And also the final point is, if you have high interest debts, pay those down first ahead of, say, mortgage repayments, because high interest is the thing that's a real killer in the current environment with rates are. Anyway, so thank you very much for watching. And before I go, the dogs are still in their beds asleep. They've hardly moved all show. So, there you go. Luna's given a wiggle. So there you go. Just to show that they are still around. And I'll look forward to seeing you next time. And I'll be doing another show on mortgage stress in the new year when I've got the updated information from our surveys, which will come out probably in the first couple of weeks of January. So this is Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics signing off. We'll see you next time. Take care.